Guardian Radio, your station for up-to-the-minute news, intelligent, interactive, and engaging conversation. 96.9 FM. The views and opinions of the hosts and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the position of the management and staff of Guardian Network.
Good morning and welcome back to Guardian Radio 96.9 FM, your station for fresh news, smart talk all day. Listen, it is Tuesday, the 7th of December, 2021, and you are on the clock with Erin, Greene. On the clock, we engage organizations, institutions, social and cultural leaders, and ordinary people to better understand the impact of public policy, private sector development, and emerging social and consumer trends. On the clock, we have conversations that help us understand and navigate a rapidly changing Bahamas. My guest today is Dr. Reginald Eldon from the Methodist Church, and I'd say the Methodist family here in the Bahamas. But before we get into that portion of the show, I want to give you the call-in information. I think you're going to enjoy this discussion. And then I got a couple of quick notes to make. But first of all, I learned, let me give you the call-in information first. You can call us at 323-6232, 325-4316, 325-4259. That's 323-6232, 325-4316, or 325-4259. You can also text us on the Guardian Radio text line. That's 422-GR96. That's 422-4796. We're powered by BTC. Standard text rates apply. So yesterday, I learned a new word. That word is invidious. And the definition of that word is you're likely to arouse or incur resentment or anger in others. She'd put herself in an invidious position is how you would use the word. I like that. I was listening to Mia Motley. She was doing her thing. She was chatting down plantation model banking systems and plantation model development systems in one old address from way back when, all the way back in October 27, 2021. It's millennials away. It's a long time. But Motley, I don't know if that's a bad thing, you know. She said when she's telling, I don't want you all to feel like I being invidious, you know. I don't want you all, I don't want to be invidious. I don't want you all to get upset at me, but I need to tell you, this whole banking system thing is not working. It's just not working. And I really appreciate that, Mia Motley. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me that there ain't nothing wrong with being invidious sometimes, but only sometimes. Only sometimes. Anyway, there's lots in the news today, but we're not going to get into much of it. My guest, Mr. Reginald Eldon, is here with me today to talk about grief, death, and loss. Mr. Eldon, Dr. Eldon, has been in ministry with the Methodist Church of the Bahamas for over 40 years. He retired from the Methodist Church as Dean of Adult Education at Queens College, Nassau, in August 2019. He worked with the One Eleuthera Foundation, an NGO based in Eleuthera, as a consultant in leadership development and education. Mr. Eldon grew up in the small settlement of the current Eleuthera. First of all, I don't believe that. Ain't nothing small about the current. Mr. Eldon went to seminary for his graduate studies at Eden Theological Seminary in St. Louis. For 18 years, he worked as the youth director for the Methodist Church in the Bahamas, where he pioneered youth camps and youth leadership development in all islands of the Bahamas and the Turks and Caicos. Following his work in youth ministry, he served as the general secretary to the Bahamas Conference of the Methodist Church for 15 years. In 2008, he was appointed dean of the Center for Leadership, Education, and Training. Reginald Eldon has worked for many years in the Juvenile Justice Program in the Bahamas. He is also a Justice of the Peace and Marriage Officer for the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. His ministry in areas of death and dying and grief recovery continue to be his central work. And I've invited Dr. Eldon here today to talk about just that, death, dying, the process of dying, grief, and loss. And I think, as I was saying to Mr. Eldon earlier, surely we have been experiencing a crisis in our culture where we have forgotten how to honor the dead. And this is long before the pandemic and the difficult dynamics presented to us, the way that it changed the way that we do traditional things. But before the pandemic, before the event, the tragic event of Hurricane Dorian, before then it was clear to me that we were having difficulty maintaining or creating new ways of honoring the dead. And now, in 2021, as we prepare for 2022, I feel like we, the Bahamian people, need to come together. And if we focus on one thing moving into 2022, we need to focus on this process of, this part of life, this process of life, dying, death, loss, and grieving. And how do we help and support each other as we move through these natural processes and parts of life? Well, I think it's a very important discussion. I hope you join us today. Please feel free to call in and ask questions. Dr. Eldon is a grief recovery and death counselor and counseling specialist. And I know Dr. Eldon as Uncle Reg from the Methodist Summer Youth Program. And it's something that I say on the show all the time that I have kept with me from summer camp. At least I twist it a little bit. In summer camp, we used to sing this song, "Love is something if you give it away. Give it away. You end up having more." And I believe that. And so my mantra is, ideas are something if you give them away. Give them away. If you hold them tight, you won't have any. If you lend it, spend it, and give it away, they'll roll all over the floor. So that's a mantra I brought with me from summer camp, Methodist Youth Summer Program in Jamestown, home of the Bahamian mosquito. I kid, Current. Listen, people, Current is the home of the Bahamian mosquito. You know why they don't have any airport in Current? Because mosquitoes is ferry to people from Current to Current Island and the rest of the mainlands. That's why. But I realized while I was prepping for the show yesterday, I was thinking about some things, we don't really have any mantras. We don't have any, collective slogans. I mean, we do, but I'm not going to claim them. Okay, let me tell you why I ain't going to claim them. Here are what some of the prominent mantras have been. All for me, baby. All for me. We ain't claiming that one. Now, we could sit down, social scientists, and we could look and we can extract from our culture and our society, even our political development and governance, how that mantra has infused itself in the political culture, in the social culture, even sometimes in the religious culture, right? Another one is, what we doing, squatty? We drinking. You see, that's another sort of mantra that's infused its way in politics and governance and social culture too. It's about a focus on self, a disregard for the collective and our duty of care, a disregard for our moral, our ethical, and our legal duties and obligations to others, right? We ain't holding on to that mantra. We're going to let that mantra go too. There's another mantra, became very popular over the last 2 years, and that's just road. See, in fact, I have one song I want to play, but I don't know if it's appropriate for Guardian. It's called, I'm going to say this, The Flickin' Road. That's what it's called. And it sums up, like this is the collective feeling of Bahamians. We ready for the road. Let us free. You let us free, Minister, it's just road. You see, but we can't hold that mantra either. Because while it's authentic, like while it resonates with all the Bahamians, everybody in the Bahamas was singing that song when Minis lifted the lockdown. And everybody was singing that song when Davis ended the curfew and then lifted the state of emergency. But that's not going to be our mantra either, because it doesn't capture, while it captures the sort of desire of the people to be free and that feeling of being trapped, it doesn't capture the commitment we must make to each other to ensure that everybody could just road. We ain't keeping that one either. And one of the most popular ones that I've heard from the young folks them is this one here. I don't catch feelings, I catch flights. I don't catch feelings, I catch flights. Now, I can be honest, while most of us here in the Bahamas, we can't catch flights. So all we could do is eat our feelings, right? Like, that's a realer mantra than I don't catch feelings, I catch flights. We see, I don't catch feelings, I catch flights. That's not going to be our mantra either. Because that speaks to a condition, right? Where we're saying, I'm not going to feel anything. I could just ignore you. You did something that upset me. I don't have to get into it. I don't have to resolve it. We don't have to deal with it. I can spend some money and take care of that. That's how I process my feelings. I don't deal with them. I go spend some money, make myself feel better. Catch a flight, get out of here. But what happens to those of us that don't have the money to solve our problems in that way? We don't have the money to avoid or escape conflict in that way. Well, you left with nothing but your feelings to keep you comfort. And if you've noticed the obesity epidemic amongst us, around us, that we're living in, I would suggest that more of us are catching and eating our feelings than catching flights. We got to rethink how we think about ourselves and the ideas that our identities are rooted in. See, none of these, even though they sum up what many of us are feeling, we can't hold these as mantras. We got to develop a new thing. It's time for us to carve out a new normal, a true new normal. And we have to carve it out. We have to carve it out of ourselves and our lived experiences. And I've invited Dr. Eldon here today to talk with me about grief, death, and loss, and how we can, I think I tried to write it down I was trying to be very fancy and write it down, but I don't think I could capture it, but how we can hold on to the most important parts of ourselves while forging a necessary new way forward. We can't move forward without understanding the space that death holds in our life and the importance of recognizing loss and the grieving process. Good morning, Dr. Eldon. How are you?
Well, good morning. Thanks. It's so good to be with you, my dear friend from when you was a child.
You could say, in fact,
right.
it's plenty people I know in many ways, right? And we talk about loss. You could imagine that sometimes I feel lost when I see you on the road and I know it's no longer appropriate to call you Uncle Reg.
I don't mind. My favorite thing is to be called Reg, and unless it's a very formal place, I keep telling people it's okay to call me Reg. That's who I am. That's all I am, and I'm okay with that. And I can do Reg. The Reg is good. That's pretty much what I'm known as, and that works. Yeah. So we spent a lot of time together, Erin. We every summer. I don't know how old you was when you first came to the first youth camp.
5.
5.
I was under the limit. I was under the minimum age.
Yes, you and your sister Corey, and of course I was very friendly with your mom, and that made a connection. And then she was very friendly with Reverend Kenris Carey and that family, and I think that's how you got into camp in the first place.
But first, let me say good morning to Auntie Kenris, Auntie Audrey,
Yes.
even Auntie Cheryl Carey.
Of course,
right?
of
yes.
course, yeah. And then you stayed until you was what, 18?
Yeah.
You became a director of sports, and yeah. So we've spent a lot of summers together. I've always observed your tenacity and your courage and your ability to not be normal in terms of accepting what everybody else accepts and challenging, and because of that, developing an incredible integrity. And I'm very proud to be your friend.
Thank you.
Yep.
Same here. Same here. Absolutely. So let's start with the book, because really, I saw the book and I said, this is a conversation that we have to have. And so you have curated a collection of eulogies that you would have written and delivered over 40 years of service in the church. And so this is not just a collection of eulogies, but this is a collection of shared experiences with people that you have known and grown with and worked with. But tell us a bit about the book in memory of them.
Yes. When I was General Secretary of the Methodist Church, my good friend Vannie Johnson, who was my travel agent as well, because I was traveling so much to Eleuthera, she gave me the title of Minister of Funerals. And every time I went to Eleuthera, it was basically to do a funeral, to officiate at a funeral. Mm-hmm. And I remember one time I got out of my car in Savannah Sound. We were celebrating the 200th anniversary of the Methodist Church there. And Miss Major, one of my dear friends in Toppin Bay, her granddaughter, Aaliyah, they came out of their car the same time I came out of my car. Actually, I tell the story in the introduction to the book. And she saw me. She was a little girl, maybe 5 or 6, and she ran to her grandmother and she said, "Mommy, mommy, mommy, who dead? Who dead?" Because she saw me, she immediately associated that I was there for a funeral because she'd seen me officiating so much. So what has happened over the years, I have spoken, given tributes, given eulogies to many of my friends, many of my family, and sometimes the family of a dear friend. For instance, in the book there are 2 eulogies, one for Theodis Johnson, who was a young man, 28 years, who was gunned down and shot in his car, and his sister a few years later, 11 years later, I think, Margot Gibbs, who actually died very suddenly after being taken sick during the day, and by that night she had died. They were the children of my dear friend Agnes Johnson, who's a stalwart member of Ebenezer Methodist Church and is known as the Mint Lady, because every morning before church starts, she moves around giving mints to people in the congregation. But she's my dear friend, and I was privileged to conduct Theodos's funeral, probably one of the most difficult funerals I've ever dealt with, because there was so much grief. He was so young, and his mother grieved so much at that funeral. And then I was officiant with Reverend Milton Lightburn at Margot's funeral. So all of the people in this book are very closely connected with me. And about 5 years ago, I had the idea that I should put these eulogies into a book so that we could remember the people. And then I came across this incredible statement by George Eliot. Our dead are never dead to us until we have forgotten them. And that was really something that hit me. And I said, that's my intro line. That's how I'm going to introduce the book. Because sometimes when we stop remembering and we stop talking about, we stop honoring. I remember when my mom died. She died at 61. She had breast cancer. It was years before we could actually sit down as family to talk and laugh about her and her life and our experiences. It hurt too much.
Yeah.
I remember numbers of Christmases and birthdays afterwards, no one would even mention her name because we just couldn't talk about it. Now, of course, it's been a long time, and we can sit down and talk about her steamed fish and her steamed conch and her peas and rice and her pineapple tarts and enjoy the memories. But sometimes grief is so severe and it hurts so much until it's very difficult for people to talk about it. Yeah. So I wrote the book mainly to honor the people that had impacted my life. In this book, there are people like Terence Bethel,
yes,
who was my dear friend.
And a member of the Guardian family.
And a member of the Guardian family. A brilliant mind, brilliant kid. And he was with me since, he started working with Kemp since he was 13 years old.
And, so for me, the loss is multi-layered. I know Terence's uncle, Terence. I know Terence as a fellow camp counselor. I know Terence in the media, and then as a co-host on the show. And so, there were just multiple layers of loss there.
You have just used an incredible term. I don't know if you knew you was using it, but multi-layered is exactly the term. Because most people, if you remember, like in experiences where there's either tragic death, like quick death, like immediate death, where there's sudden death, where there's catastrophe death, whatever. Every person in the family, for instance, reacts differently. So you may see some people in families paying so much attention to details, like they're making sure the house is ready, they're making sure all the clothes are in order, they're making sure the program is done properly. And it's almost like they've got a tunnel vision on that, and they're doing that, and that's what they're doing. If you try to detour them from that, they can easily go ballistic or just lose it. Yeah. That's their way of coping and getting through it. And so I just leave them alone in typical grief situations. It's like, okay, like their emphasis on, no, we got to make sure this program is the best program ever, and it's got to be done. We got to proofread 6 times. You go get it to. It's okay. That's how they're doing that. But if you look at a typical Bahamian family, you will find that other people, every member of the family, perhaps is treating grief differently, living with it differently. Some people sit down in the chair or lay in the bed and they cry the whole day. Other people never shed a tear. Yeah. And sometimes, in terms of helping people, you may be drawn more to the person who is more outwardly expressing their grief, weeping and crying and screaming. Sometimes that's not the worst person in terms of how they're being affected by the grief. And so it's an interesting way of looking at grief overall. But I wrote the book because I wanted to honor these people. For instance, the first person in the book is a lady that is from Abaco originally, went to Ebenezer all her life. She was the person that helped me most in my ministry in terms of her name's Louise Albury. She every event that I had during my term as General Secretary and CLAT, and even during youth ministry, when we used to have our big Palm Sunday lunches to help raise money, this little short woman, and I entitled her eulogy "Short in Stature, Big in Heart," because she's probably 4 feet 10 or whatever, maybe 5 feet, I don't know. But she would put together every meal, every catering event. I never had to worry about that, and it was always done at a level of class and sophistication that even surprised me. So when I spoke to her funeral and gave the eulogy, it was like, this is a woman that had a ministry. She didn't preach in the pulpit. She didn't pray in prayer meetings. She didn't get up in the leaders' meeting or congregational board or whatever. But did she ever preach sermons? Because she was committed to her what she had as her giftedness. And then there's another person in here, Patrick Bethel, the great educator from Abaco. Patrick was my dear friend, and he spent his life educating people, but there was more to him than just that, because he's probably one of the few people I know that really did not see color. And I think I've often said about him, he was colorblind. I don't think he could tell whether a person was black or white or what. Just didn't matter. He had such a kind of magnanimous spirit of acceptance and inclusion. And you talk about your new slogan, ideas to give away, that was him. He embodied that. It was like he would give out stuff and say, can you do this? You know, he would always call me sometimes 10, 11 o'clock in the night when he was home. And he'd said his typical coming online was, Reg, Patrick here. And then he would start telling me what he thought I should be doing. But an incredible Bahamian man who contributed so much to the development and infrastructure of community and education in the country. But getting back to Terence Bethel, Terence was I would say he was a way shower. I wrote in his eulogy that I think the entire Bahamas was shortchanged in his sudden death. Some people say that when a person dies, their work is finished. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think tragedy sometimes happens, and mistakes happen, and there's a big debate about all of that. But Terence had a lot more to give. I don't think he was empty. I remember when Pastor Miles Monroe died in the plane crash, a lot of people who wrote about that and wrote about his life. I remember somebody, I don't know who it was, said that he returned to God empty, that he had given all he had. And many people are like that. I don't think Terence was empty. I think Terence had a lot more to give, and we are the ones that I haven't gotten over his death yet, and it's very difficult for me to deal with it. I really wanted him to get elected to Parliament. I had promised him I was going to work with his campaign, and I thought that would be a crown and achievement for him. But, you know, what do we have to say?
Well, I can let him know that maybe your years at summer camp was the best.
Yes.
Maybe what you poured into them little childrens like me was the best, right? And I mean, yeah, we upset that you didn't get to live out your dream, but us little childrens are happy that you shared it with us and not with them politicians.
Absolutely.
Right,
Absolutely.
not with those politicians. Well, listen, I want to get to this caller in a second, Arlington, and then we'll go to a break. But I want to share this. I was working on a short project. Someone said, hey, can you come and help me rescue some books from a library, sort of impromptu library that had been popped up in this office space. And while I was going through the books, I found a book written by Terence and another person. And it was bound up the same way we used to have to bind up the books for summer camp. And so there was the original and there was a duplicate. And I picked up the phone to call Terence to find out if he wanted a copy of the original, if he had one, if he wanted one. And it went to voicemail. And I never got through to him, you know, and then discovered a couple of days later that when I had called here that had passed, right? And so it'll always be right there, you know. And in that sense, I feel you, because I had to give you these books, sir. We had to have these conversations, sir. You did not go empty, you know, although you tried, although you tried to pour yourself out. Arlington, is there a caller on the line still? And while we lost that caller, when we come back from the break, here's what we're going to do. I want to talk about collective grief and grieving collectively. I want to make a segue into the importance of ensuring that we intentionally foster new rules around funerals and funeral rites and how we can practice these things. And then connect it to some of the stories in the news and why writing eulogies are so important for collective grief. Anyway, I would like to thank you for joining this conversation. You're on the clock with Erin Greene. We're on Guardian Radio 96.9 FM. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after this break.
At Fidelity, the holidays are all about family, spending time with loved ones, and being thankful for the little things in life. Worrying about bills should be the last thing on your mind, especially during the holidays. Let Fidelity help you get your bills under control. Fidelity can also get you started with a real savings plan that actually pays you interest. The only thing you need to think about is what you will do with the savings in your pocket this Christmas. Now that's what I'm talking about. Fidelity Bank is here for you this holiday season because you are family, and family is important to us.
Like what you're hearing on the show? Want to support the conversation? Sponsor On the Clock today. Call Janet Lees at 302-2304. That's 302-2304. Be the solution. Sponsor On the Clock with Erin Greene, where she dissects, we discuss, and you decide.
This is Guardian Radio 96.9 FM. Fresh news, smart talk, all day.
Good morning and welcome back to On the Clock with Erin Greene. You're tuned into Guardian Radio 96.9 FM on this good Tuesday. No AC, 7th of December. We're loving these days more and more. Dr. Eldon, I got a couple of texts here. The first one says, great show as usual. This one's about boundaries. I got another one here that says, Miss Greene, you and your guests don't get mad at me. But us black people don't talk about death. Only white people is talk about them morbid things. We in the black community stay away from death, except Pookie them in the hood that like to shoot up each other. That's what the text is saying. And one of the questions I sort of carved out was, why does it seem like non-Western and non-Caribbean countries are more intentional in adherence to or the practicing rituals and rites around death, and sort of like this text has said, and we Afro-Caribbean people and people in the Caribbean generally are we a little uncomfortable with it. We don't want to talk about it. We whisper about it. As I've made announcements about people passing on the show, there's a degree of discomfort. Am I doing it the right way? And a part of me is like, look, we are to celebrate life when it is past. And there's nothing to be discomforted by sharing this information. But I realize that a lot of people are like, oh, wait, did you have permission to say that? You didn't say this. You're supposed to say this when you say that. And so as a grief counselor, how did we get here?
This is a very interesting question. It's an area that we need to look at. We have spent a lot of time in the Bahamas in terms of what I've talked about in some other circles as the evolvement of funerals. In the book that I just published, I talked about the very first funeral that I can remember in the current was an old woman who had died. Children were never allowed to go to funerals when I was a child. And this funeral was for a black woman in Current. And of course, there's such a difference in this country between black and white funerals a lot of times.
Yeah.
And one of the main differences in Current and Eleuthera would be probably having the inclusion of a band to play from the church to the cemetery and whatever. I was literally scared because this band was there, and then the coffin was made out of wood that had been varnished, and it looked spooky, and and that was my first experience of a funeral that I can remember. And then it moved from there to, of course, where we had funerals where, like to Sir Dermot Knowles' funeral that I was privileged to officiate at, where you have big Ebenezer Church packed to the seams and hundreds and hundreds of people and two prime ministers and all those kinds of things. So one of the things that has happened in that journey, evolvement, is that Bahamian people, I feel, we tend to put a lot of emphasis on the external. When we do that, that keeps us away from inward processing, and we don't think through and process. And because some people in the family or some people in the situation are not comfortable with grief and don't know how to handle it, like for the typical sayings that we keep hearing, which are sayings we should never use when someone dies, they're in a better place. How does that sound when you've just lost your mother? The good place for her was by you and with you. And there's other sayings that we hear, you know, God picks the best roses. Well, that's not a good concept to start thinking of. And then the other thing we keep imposing on people is be strong, don't cry, be strong. All of those, the cliches and the sayings that we've learned and picked up over the years, to me, they're wrong. They're not things we need to say. Sometimes if a person is weeping and mourning really extensively and loudly and like it upsets us, and therefore we think, well, okay, I've got to try to stop her from crying. But the best thing we can do is just be there, put our arms around the person or just sit with them. And most times when a person is dying or a person has died and I'm called, like I've spent so many times around hospital beds where families just called me to be there, I don't do anything except I'm there. And if they want to talk, if they want to say something, I will respond. But many times, what we call in the counseling world, the gift of presence. You know, you're there because you have an empathetic heart. You're there because you're not condemning. You're there because you're not going to blame them or let them know that, make them think this is their fault or whatever. And one of my big jobs in grief counseling is to let them know that God hasn't done this to them because they're awful people or that God doesn't like them or God doesn't love them. God loves them even more. And of course, the story in the Gospel of Mary and Martha and Lazarus is always a good story to refer to. But I think we've come to the place where we treat funerals pretty much like weddings almost, because there's more preparation for outfits and everybody's got to be dressed in the same colors and the corpse has to be dressed in the same colors the people's wearing and I find it really weird, Erin, sometimes in funerals whereby the people at the funeral are dressed up in black and all the families dressed in yellow and turquoise or pink and blue and whatever. I find that really, really weird. I see some changes in that now where people don't necessarily all wear black. But I think the thing that we need to push towards is to find safe places where people can talk. And sometimes that's in groups of 2 or groups of 3 or groups of 4, never in a big group of 25 people.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things we need to start working on and getting people prepared to, because grief cannot be processed if it stays bottled up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, I was going to say, you know, it's always great to add a touch of humor to the situation, but sensitively. So when you said, listen, you invite me to the sort of deathbed and I just come and I'm present, but I want you to know there's a reason why you're there. If God ever shows up, buddy, you're in charge and you have to answer the questions.
God always shows up. God, you know that. God's always there.
Right? But,
yeah.
That's awesome. So another thing I wanted to ask is, how do grief counselors process all this grief? Right? And again, I looked in the book and I thought to myself, well, if I knew Reverend Henry White in Eleuthera, I would be making regular trips to James Siston for some of that bread, right? Like that would be a practice that I would use as therapy. But then I realized that Reverend White is also featured in your book in memory of them, And I remember being at summer camp and Reverend White was in charge of the kitchen and he's in charge of the bread. And he had to bake 175 loaves of bread a day. So he was always monitoring the bread. And I always remembered him as sort of a hard taskmaster. He wanted to encourage you especially when you were on your chores, the importance of keeping the kitchen clean and doing this job well. And then going back to Eleuthera years later to find Reverend White and how he laughed, how he smiled and he laughed and he looked at me as a big woman, right? But how do grief counselors process all of this grief that they hold and help others process?
Well, one of the people that's in the book is my good friend Dorothea Mills, who died last January. And she had a term that she always used in terms of counselors in general. We generally transmute, and we take the stuff in. We take it from you. We listen. It's a way that stays in our system, but then we have to develop what they call spiritual practices where we then can transmute that, can move that out. Sometimes that's done through exercise, sometimes that's done through a kind of liturgical movement within ourselves, sometimes that's done through talking to another grief counselor, a person that understands. All psychologists, psychiatrists, grief counselors, ministers really should have a person that they confide in, that they don't carry those things by themselves. I have one or two friends that I do a lot of processing with. I also journal and I also write a lot. And one of the good things about this book is this has been a healing process for me.
Right.
Because being able to honor these people. I remember when I was writing the book, one of my friends said, "You must be the saddest person in the world. How do you do this? Sit down all day," because this took almost a year to get to the point of publication. And he said, "You're going to be depressed. It's like you're dealing with death." I said, "No, I'm not. I'm dealing with life." These are people that impacted my life and the lives of hundreds of people. And these are people, the good thing about this book is that there are ordinary people. There's a woman in here who we call Sister, Willa Mae Bethel from James's Siston. She lived with two adult physically challenged children in a little two-room place in JC up on the hill where the fridge and the stove and the oil stove and the bed, everything was right next to each other. And Hurricane Andrew in 1992 took the roof off the house and whatever. And the Methodist Church had a big hurricane relief effort going called the Disaster Committee Relief. And we joined with the Presbyterian Church. We went to her. When I got in JC, Pastor White said, "Reg, we have to go to Sister's house because Sister needs a house." That's what they called her, Sister. We got there, we saw the situation, and she literally held onto my hands and looked in my eyes and tears coming down and said, "Brother Reg, you have to build me a house." And that morning I promised her, "Yes, we're going to build you a house." And the Presbyterian Church put up the money. We built the house. We built her a nice little 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house. And I never forget her gratitude and the way she expressed her blessing and talked about that. And that's why I wanted to tell some of these stories, because it's about ordinary Bahamian people who had integrity, who blessed others, who lived moral lives and did really well. And those are the people that Sir Dermot is in here, Lady Margaret Simmons is in here, Lady Ina Brannan is in here. But there's also ordinary men and women who just lived good Bahamian lives and brought up incredible children.
Right. Like ordinary lives and
yeah.
extraordinary experiences.
Exactly, you got it.
Absolutely. So I sort of slunked on the phone calls. I'm going to take this phone call, read a couple of texts, and then we're going to close out the show. Good morning, caller. You're on the clock.
Good morning, Erin, Greene, and good morning to the gentleman.
Good morning.
You have a good show.
Thank you.
What prompted me to call was I think the government and the private sector should introduce a counseling program. I'm a counselor too, for various events of life, even in the most tragic moments of gang violence, suicide, and what have you. We need a counseling program where a person could turn to on a 24-hour basis, but at the same time, let us jail. That's one of the things we don't have in the Bahamas. I've seen it in the U.S. I think the gentleman probably know what I'm talking about, too. You could train folks to be counselors.
Yeah.
And that's what I like to see in the Bahamas, because you see a lot of mental issues. And those mental issues develop because we don't have counselors.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, I agree. One of the things I would like to see, and I'm ready to talk about this with some people, is a regular grief recovery program offered through the schools, like especially for children. There's, we experience in many areas of loss. Grief is not only when somebody dies. Grief is when you lose anything, like you lose your career, when you lose your house, when you lose your job, when you lose a good friend. There's so much grief in this country where friends have disappointed each other and left them, and where there's breakdown in communication, and people who were good friends for all their lives, they no longer speak to each other. Let me assure you, if you're out there listening, that this is a form of grief. And sometimes when you're not feeling well and you feel there's no energy and you feel down and you're getting sick and you feel like, many times this is the result of deep grief, and grief that you have not been able to process over loss. Sometimes when you lose some of your physical attributes, like people when they start getting older and they're no longer able to take care of themselves physically and do the things that they did physically, that's a form of loss. When some people lose a pet that was close to them, a lot of people say, well, pets are not important, or they don't have souls, or whatever. But listen, if an old person is living with a cat or a dog, and that's the only companion they've had for the last 10 years, when that animal dies, that's a major loss.
What is it? I feel lost for the animals in my neighborhood.
Yeah,
Right?
I know.
In fact, when a dog I didn't even know walked past me, watched me walk to my front door, and then stopped to watch me get inside the house. And I felt this connection with this dog. I like, poor King, stop being so nice.
No, Erin, this is true, and I just wanted to say that before we wrap up, that there are people that can help. The caller who just said there are counselors. Many times you have to search around to get the right counselor, because you have to pair up well, because every person is on a different journey. Every person looks at life differently. Every person has a different level of sensitivity or openness or empathy or issues or whatever. Not all counselors can work with everybody. You need to find somebody who can work with your situation. And counselors need to be, I always say that we need to be open and accepting. And one of my favorite authors that I've taught so many, many years is a Jesuit priest named Henry Nouwen. And he talks about positions that we take in life in terms of a spiritual position. And he says that one of the positions that we need to move to in a community in the world is to move from a position of hostility to a position of hospitality. Hospitality doesn't mean giving people tea and coffee and biscuits. Hospitality means welcoming the stranger. And opening your space, your personal space, your arms, your soul, to listen to people and to accept people. And that's what grief counseling is about. Grief counseling is basically saying, I know it hurts, I know this is hard for you, but you can recover, you can get better. And there's a process that we can go through to make this happen.
And here's a mango, because a mango is going to make you feel better. Trust me, right? And that's going to be my tagline when I take up this line of work. Dr. Eldon, this has been fabulous. We haven't touched everything.
No, we haven't. We haven't. I don't know where this hour has gone to. This is very quick.
What I'm going to ask you to do is to find one young person to come with you next week, so we could interrogate some young people, and how they are processing loss, grief, and death in the time of COVID approaching the holiday season, but particularly for young people, because I don't think. In fact, I didn't think of it until just now. I don't know if we've even considered that young people are experiencing a loss of a future, right? A loss of a future perceived, imagined, dreamed, with so little control over returning to that dream, let alone the actual future. And so I think these are all important conversations. Thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you to my audience for staying connected to the conversation. I have a text here that says, you better bring Pastor Reg back on because your time run out. And also another text says, which church are you now attending? Because you are retired now from ministry, right?
Yes, I'm retired. I'm beginning a practice in spiritual development and spiritual counseling for people who want to go deeper inside and not particularly religious or tradition, and to find out what the purpose of their life is and what God's got planned for them now. So I'm fully retired from the Methodist Church, but I attend Ebenezer Methodist Church. That's my home church.
And where can people find a copy of In Memory of Them?
Right now, we don't have it posted at a bookstore, but we're thinking that it's going to be available at Joseph's Bookstore on Soldier Road, and people can write to me at regweldon@gmail.com. Contact Erin, and she will give you the information. And we're going to be selling the book on Sunday night outside of Ebenezer, following the Ebenezer Methodist concert, music department's concert. So we'll be in the gazebo after the service, and I will deliver books, do whatever to help people out. That's what I've been doing.
Absolutely. And I intend to have you on next week so we could talk about the process of collective grieving and how we as a society can reconcile with tragedies in the media, like
yes,
the baby
I want to talk
disaster.
about that, because many times we live our personal grief through collective grief, and that's an area that I want to talk about.
Absolutely. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Erin.
to my producer for not cutting us off 3 minutes ago.
Thank you.
You know it's 11 a.m. That means it's time for Levon Miller and Unleash. So stay tuned to Guardian Radio 96.9 FM, and then remember to tune in again tomorrow so you could be on the clock with Erin Greene.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
so much, Dr. Eldon.